want to see child labor used. I don't want to see people being underpaid for their work.
How well the people are treated, the standard, the environment that they're working in.
We're fairly treated and, and paid properly.
Is it made more by humans or less by humans?
Conditions that the workers are working in.
Whether or not if the factory workers are treated with respect.
Did this come from USA or China or Russia?
So when we launched the Footprint Chronicles, we were sort of opening the doors on transparency with Patagonia. This is how we do business. This is our supply chain. This is where our products come from. And interestingly, we got a lot of feedback from different stakeholders who said, I'm really interested in the labor conditions and the human rights of the people who are making your clothes. And I think because everyone knew Patagonia is an environmental company, there was a lot of questions of like, okay, what are you doing socially? And it caused us to want to go out and look at our own internal processes as well as ask experts in the field about what's going on globally around social responsibility and human rights.
The world economy has changed in a fundamental way in the past, I would say, 25 years. The 20th century model was General Motors, a huge corporation with hundreds of thousands of workers in its own factories. A manufacturer like General Motors actually made things. That was a supply chain that was driven by the producer, by the manufacturer. The 21st century, Walmart is the iconic figure, a retailer that doesn't really make anything. Or Patagonia. Patagonia is what I would call a branded marketer. It creates brand identification, and then it markets that identification, creates demand, desire for its product, Patagonia quite effectively. But it doesn't make anything, so it's a manufacturer in name only. What it does is it outsources through global supply chains, and that has led to a parallel change in how workers and businesses relate to each other.
Well, I think one of the problems is that in many countries, governments have abdicated their responsibility to protect their own people in the workplace. There are huge competitive pressures. Governments want to be a good environment for foreign investors, and so they, in effect, dumb down the law.
Well, it's easy sitting in a developed country to think that the developing countries that produce a lot of what we use every day are really far away. Actually, they're very close. Every day we're buying stuff and putting it into our homes, into our mouths, into our kids' mouths, that comes from China and comes from other countries around the world.
If you look at the more developed industrialized countries, they have in place all kinds of laws, civil, penal, labor-related, and fiscal, and so on and on and on. If you go to developing countries, low-income countries, the scope and the rule of law is very limited. So when we engage in international trade with countries in those conditions, obviously, there's a tremendous challenge for their governments to improve labor law and enforcement of labor laws and other laws. But there's also a challenge for the companies that do business and for the other countries that invest in those low-income countries to make sure that they can elevate their levels of regulation to a minimum level.
The perception that these foreign countries are far away and unrelated to our lives is false. I think that what happens in China doesn't stay in China. It comes into our homes every single day.
You know, China is just a hotbed of conversation all the time. I think that globally the sense is that there's a lot of workers' rights violations or working conditions are horrible there. It's really a case by case. There's no blanket statement that says, you know, here's what we're going to do in China. It's like, okay, case by case. There are really good factories in China and there are really bad factories in China. So we really have to evaluate one by one.
China deserves a lot of focus because it's a very, very big country. And a lot of what happens here will determine our future in many different contexts.
What China offers to the world is not just cheap labor. It's the efficiency of having all the parts that you need within 2 hours of your factory, the supply chain cluster. It's the number of vessel departures from the Chinese ports. It's the speed with which you can get things off the coast and on its way to Los Angeles. It's just an incredible manufacturing machine that's developed in China, and it's not just about labor.
I think we're citizens of the world, and I think it is in our interest, national security and otherwise, that China be successful. Plus our economies are so integrated. So I don't think production should be moved out of China. I think that China should be held accountable for both labor and social standards in their production. Businesses are going to follow low wages, so the challenge is to raise the bar everywhere.
So global sourcing is a lot more difficult than just looking for low wages. And in fact, a lot of companies don't go to the countries that have the lowest wages because those countries can't provide the product that they need.
And it's not just Chinese people. It's people in Bangladesh. It's people in Mexico. It's people all around the world. Those people have the same rights as all of us. And so we are intimately related to their lives because we are consumers who buy the products that they make.
I think the reason why customers are coming to us and saying, I'm concerned about the social conditions in the factories is because there was a lot of noise in the media, in popular discourse around sweatshop labor, poor factory conditions, going to countries because of low labor standards, that sort of thing. So the landscape for which people were hearing things and learning about it was pretty complicated, and it didn't sound very good.
When we were first teaching about sweatshops, people would maybe show a video from the National Labor Committee, and those are pretty horrifying, and they'd say, well, that's really awful and I feel terrible, but there's nothing I can do about it, so I'm just going to forget about it and pretend it doesn't exist. Well, now, if we can make that connection with it, yes, you are connected to this. Yes, the factory's halfway around the world, but your day-to-day decisions impact that worker in the factory and all those workers in the factory. Consumers need a lot more information. It's so important for brands to be transparent about this, to give consumers the kind of information they need. I've done surveys of consumers across the U.S. and asked them about purchasing from socially responsible companies, and they tell me a big problem is they don't know who those are.
As it is now, I go into a store, all I get is the name of the country where something is made. I know more about where my eggs come from and the conditions of the chickens that laid them than I do about the people who made my dress. And I think that situation has to change.
For any brand who does decide to become transparent, they've got to be ready for it, because you are going to suddenly invite a whole lot of understandably critical and skeptical eyes into your company or into parts of your company, and they might not like what they see, and you've got to be ready for some tough discussions.
What's really important is that leader companies take chances, experiment, begin to really unpack what the problems are and how to address them individually and collectively, and that they be given a reward by consumers and investors for getting into the place where they're part of the process of moving the debate forward.
I'd like to see even more transparency. I'd like to see, our companies participate in social compliance in ways that are more detailed and more comprehensive in terms of how we collect information and what information we act on. And that there's more sharing of information that goes on so that we can work together more as strategic partners.
In terms of the big picture, how do you solve global labor problems? A three-legged stool. First, international laws, regulations, whether they be treaties between countries, which include labor standards and environmental standards. Secondly, importantly, the right of workers to form their own unions, independent unions, if they so choose. and the right to go out and strike. This should also be a goal because ultimately I think workers' own voice, representing themselves, is key. The third leg of the stool, which I think is the weakest leg but still important, is corporate social responsibility. Anti-sweatshop activists and I are mistrustful of businesses that claim they're going to be socially responsible. It's often a smokescreen for shoddy practices and good public relations. If there is to be corporate social responsibility, I think it has to be truly transparent.
Patagonia is actually an incredibly small company if you look at sort of the landscape of businesses that are out there, especially in the apparel industry. And so we can come to a factory that may not be totally where we want them to be in the social side of things. And so in order for us to get them there, we can't alone do that. We have to bring in the government, we have to bring in local NGOs, and the factory management has to be on board. And so it's very challenging for us to do that. And so we've got to be creative.
So I think, you know, companies need to take a much more active role in articulating a new consciousness in the way they produce and the way they market. I can remember some years back when the FLA had an occasion to meet with the labor minister of China who was visiting Washington. And we had a dinner with her, and she confessed in the dinner that she had been absolutely stunned to have a group of American companies tell her that they wanted to protect labor rights. She had not expected that. I don't think she knew quite how to respond to it, but it made me realize for the first time how much power companies have when they articulate these kinds of values in politically important places.
Either you avoid that country, which might not make a lot of business sense and does not even make social sense, or you say, we're going to go in, but we're going to help them fix these problems. And I think that's where the socially responsible companies choose to go. They say, we can't just walk away from these issues. We have a social responsibility to become part of the solution here. And they then figure out how they can work with their suppliers, with local civil society organizations, and not necessarily try and solve those problems on their own, but play a convening or a facilitating role, a catalytic role, in order to get that stuff addressed.
But what people remember are the stories you tell them. And compelling stories, not just stories of success, but stories of challenge and failure, because you learn from the failures also. A little bit of honesty would convince people that this is not just a public relations ploy to sell product, but a real effort to grapple with some of the most serious issues that face us today, environmental and human.
And that's a lot harder story to tell consumers. You know, forced labor, yeah, you don't want to see the people locked in factories, and that's an easy thing for consumers to understand. It's a lot harder for consumers to understand, I think, the need for freedom of association and collective bargaining. So that's challenging. You know, how do you tell the story to consumers in a simple enough way to make them feel like they can act on it, but not make it so simple that it's way too simple? Because this is not black and white, and it's very, very gray and very complex, and but it's very real.
And consumers have an incredible amount of power that way. How they choose to spend their dollars and with which company sends a message to the corporate world what values are important. And tacked on to that, Patagonia receives letters often from consumers saying, I am very concerned about the social responsibility in which my products are made, and how are you as a company upholding those values? And that in turn puts responsibility on Patagonia to make sure that the way we do our business upholds our standards around social responsibility.